Imagine walking into a room filled with people who share your blood yet treat you like a ghost while the aroma of a home-cooked meal turns into the scent of betrayal in the air. I stood there in the center of my mother's dining room surrounded by 33 relatives who had known me since I was a baby, but not one person looked up or offered a chair. They laughed and passed plates of turkey and mashed potatoes as if I were invisible, or worse, as if I were a stranger who had crashed a private party. My own mother wouldn't even catch my eye as she handed a glass of wine to my cousin, who had always been the golden child, while I stood there with my coat still on, clutching a gift nobody wanted to open. This is the story of the night I realized that family isn't always about who shares your DNA, and the shocking secret I uncovered while standing in the shadows of my own home that changed everything forever. The tires of my old sedan crunched over the frozen gravel of the driveway, leading up to my childhood home in the heart of rural Pennsylvania. My name is Elena, and for the first time in 5 years, I was coming home for the massive family dinner my mother hosted every single winter. The air was biting cold, snapping at my exposed skin as I stepped out of the car, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill I felt in my chest. I looked at the house. It was a sprawling Victorian structure with glowing yellow windows that promised warmth and laughter, but to me it looked like a fortress I was about to storm. There were cars lined up all the way down the lane, SUVs and trucks belonging to uncles I hadn't seen since high school and cousins who were now strangers with kids of their own. My sister Sarah had texted me earlier saying that 33 people were already inside. 33 relatives all gathered under one roof to celebrate a legacy I felt increasingly detached from. Welcome back to Revenge Water Official. If you are enjoying the content and want to support the journey, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support helps Revenge Water Official grow and bring you even better videos every single day, so join the family today by clicking subscribe, and thank you for being part of the team. I reached into the back seat to grab the gift I had spent weeks picking out. It was a heavy antique clock from my mother, a peace offering of sorts. I had been working in Seattle as a graphic designer, building a life that my traditional family didn't quite understand. To Sister Sarah about the seating chart. I was standing less than 2 feet from her. I could smell her perfume. I could see the flower on her apron. I said, "Mom, it is Elena." She didn't look up. She didn't even flinch. She simply handed a bowl to Sarah and told her to make sure the kids sat at the small table in the hallway. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes. People moved around me like I was a piece of furniture. They bumped into my shoulder without apologizing. They reached over me to grab spoons. I felt a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Was I actually there? I looked down at my hands. I looked at the gift I was holding. I put the clock down on the counter and it made a loud thud, but no one turned around. I walked into the dining room where the long tables had been pushed together to form one massive banquet. I saw the place cards. I walked the entire length of the table, scanning every single name. Aunt Linda, Uncle Dave, Cousin Chloe, Mark, Sarah. I read every single one twice. My name was not there. There were 33 chairs for 33 relatives, and I was the 34th person. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. This wasn't an accident. My mother had invited me, but she hadn't planned for me. Or perhaps she had invited me just so I could witness my own exclusion. I sat down on the bottom step of the staircase that led to the second floor. From here I could see the entire dining room. I watched as they all took their seats. My father sat at the head of the table looking proud. He began to speak. He thanked everyone for coming home and talked about how important it was to keep the family together. He mentioned how every person in this room was a pillar of the community. I sat 5 feet away in the shadows, and his eyes passed right over me as if I were a ghost haunting the hallway. I started to think back to the last few years. The missed phone calls were short texts, the way they always seemed to forget my birthday. I had told myself they were just busy people living a different life, but sitting here watching 33 people eat a meal I wasn't invited to share, I realized the truth. I was the black sheep, not because I was bad, but because I was different. I had left the small town, and they had decided that by leaving the town I had left the family. But there was something deeper in their silence. It wasn't just coldness, it was a wall. A wall of absolute silence that felt like a conspiracy. As the first course was cleared and the wine started to flow more freely, I noticed my Aunt Linda whispering to my mother. They were looking at a stack of papers on the sideboard. I strained my ears to hear over the clinking of glasses. They were talking about the estate. My grandfather had passed away 6 months ago, and he was a wealthy man who owned most of the land in this valley. I had been his favorite. I was the one who stayed with him in the hospital during his final weeks while everyone else was too busy with work. But since his funeral I had heard nothing about the will. Now as I sat on the stairs I heard my mother say it is better this way since she is gone anyway, we don't need to complicate things with someone who doesn't even care to show up. My heart stopped. She is gone anyway. They were talking about me as if I were dead or vanished. They were justifying something to themselves. I realized then that my presence here was a threat to a plan they had already set in motion. They weren't ignoring me because they were mad, they were ignoring me because if they acknowledged I was there they would have to acknowledge my rights. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I wasn't going to sit on the stairs and cry like a victim. If they wanted to play a game where I didn't exist I was going to find out exactly what they were trying to hide in the dark. I stood up quietly and retreated up the stairs. The second floor was dark and quiet, the sounds of the party muffled by the thick carpets. I knew exactly where my mother kept the family records. I went into the small office at the end of the hall. The door creaked but the noise downstairs was so loud no one noticed. I turned on the small desk lamp and began to dig through the drawers. I found folders for taxes for the farm and for the mill, but then I found a thick blue folder labeled Grandfather Estate. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside were documents that had been modified recently. There was a copy of my grandfather's original will, and next to it a series of legal challenges filed by my own parents. They were trying to declare me legally estranged to bypass my inheritance. They wanted the land I had been promised because they wanted to sell it to a developer. They were selling my grandfather's legacy, and they were erasing me to do it. I sat there in the dark office clutching the papers. Downstairs 33 people were laughing and eating while plotting to steal my future. I looked out the window at the snow falling and realized I had two choices. I could walk out the door and never see them again, leaving them to their greed, or I could walk back down those stairs and force them to look at me. I heard my mother call out for a toast in the dining room. It was time for dessert. I put the papers back exactly as I found them, but I kept one small slip of paper that had a lawyer's name on it. I walked back to the stairs and looked down at the sea of faces. They looked so happy. They looked so united. And I was about to break the silence in a way they would never forget. The air in the upstairs hallway was thick with the smell of old wood, and the distant sweetness of my mother's signature apple pie, but all I could taste was the bitter copper of adrenaline as I stood at the top of the landing. Staring down into the lion's den, the laughter from the dining room sounded like static in my ears, now a sharp grating noise that made my skin crawl because I knew the truth behind those smiles. I knew that the 33 people sitting at that table, including the woman who gave birth to me, were actively participating in a lie designed to bury my existence. I felt a momentary wave of nausea, wondering how long they had been planning this. Was it months, or was it the moment they saw me pull into the driveway that they decided to commit to this collective act of gaslighting? I gripped the banister so hard my knuckles turned white, and for a second I considered just running out the door, getting in my car and disappearing into the snowy night. But then I thought of my grandfather. He was the only one who had truly seen me for who I was, and I wouldn't let them turn his final wishes into a paycheck for people who didn't even visit him. When he was dying, I took a deep breath and began my descent back into the lion's den, but this time I wasn't looking for a seat at their table, I was looking for justice. When I reached the bottom step, the scene hadn't changed much except the main course had been cleared, and the table was now cluttered with dessert plates and coffee mugs. My sister Sarah was leaning over my mother's shoulder showing her something on a tablet, and they both laughed with a casualness that felt like a slap in the face. I walked directly into the dining room and stood at the empty space where a chair should have been. I didn't say anything at first, I just stood there watching them. My Uncle Dave was right in front of me telling a story about a hunting trip he took 3 years ago. He looked me right in the eye for a split second and then his gaze just slid away as if he were looking at a pillar or a piece of wallpaper. The commitment to the act was terrifying. It wasn't just my parents, it was everyone, cousins, aunts, uncles, and even the younger ones who must have been told to ignore me. I realized then that this was a test of my own sanity. They wanted me to crack, they wanted me to scream and shout and act like the crazy daughter so they could use that behavior as further proof that I was unstable and unfit to inherit anything from the estate. So I decided to play a different game. I wouldn't scream, I would be a ghost that they couldn't stop haunting. I walked to the sideboard and picked up a clean plate, making a loud clinking sound as I did so. I watched my mother's hand tremble slightly as she poured coffee, but she didn't turn around. I moved to the center of the table, and reached for the apple pie, cutting myself a massive slice and serving it onto my plate. The room stayed loud, but I noticed the volume was becoming forced. People were talking faster, their voices rising in pitch as they tried to maintain the illusion that I wasn't standing 3 inches away from them. I sat down on the floor right behind my father's chair and began to eat my pie in silence. From this vantage point, I could see the folders I had found upstairs sitting on the buffet table, tucked under a stack of napkins. My mother had brought them down while I was in the office. She was keeping them close as if the paper itself held the power to make her lies true. I watched her fingers tap nervously on the table and I realized she was terrified. She wasn't just ignoring me out of malice, she was ignoring me out of a desperate need to keep her world from falling apart. She had already spent the money in her mind, she had already planned the renovations and the trips she was going to take with my grandfather's hard-earned wealth, and I was the only thing standing in her way. The conversation eventually turned to the mountain property, the very land my grandfather had promised me. Uncle Jim started talking about the logging rights, and how much the timber would be worth if they cleared the back 40 acres. My mother nodded eagerly, saying that the sale would take place in the spring as soon as the legalities were sorted out. She mentioned that since there were no other claimants, they could move forward with a clean title. She said the word "no other claimants" with such cold precision that it felt like a knife in my ribs. I stood up slowly, the plate still in my hand, and walked over to her. She was sitting with her back to me. I leaned down and whispered directly into her ear, "Mom, I know about the trust one, know what you did." The reaction was subtle, but it was there. She froze her fork halfway to her mouth, and for a single heartbeat the entire table went dead silent. It was a silence so heavy you could hear the snow hitting the window panes. But then my sister Sarah immediately started talking about her kids' soccer practice, and the wall of noise went back up like a shield. My mother didn't turn around, but I saw the muscles in her neck tighten and her face go pale. She knew I knew, and she was choosing to double down on the lie. I walked back to the buffet table and placed my empty plate on top of the legal folders. My mother finally reacted, jumping up to grab the papers before the residue of the pie could touch them. She looked at me then for the first time that night. Her eyes were full of a burning hatred that I had never seen before. It wasn't the look of a mother, it was the look of a cornered animal. She didn't speak, she just clutched the folders to her chest and hissed at my father that it was time to move to the living room for the gift exchange. 33 people stood up as one, moving like a school of fish away from me. They filed into the living room, leaving me alone in the wreckage of the dinner table. The room felt cold now, as if the warmth had been sucked out with them. I looked at the table, at the half-eaten food, and the scattered napkins, and I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. These people weren't my family, they were a syndicate, and I was the target of their heist. But they had made one fatal mistake. They assumed that because I was quiet I was weak. They assumed that because I had moved away I had forgotten the lessons my grandfather taught me about property and law. I followed them into the living room. Standing in the doorway as they began to open gifts, they were laughing and taking photos, acting as if it were a normal happy holiday. My cousin Chloe opened a designer handbag, and my brother Mark got a new set of golf clubs. No one looked at the gift I had brought for my mother, the antique clock, which was still sitting on the kitchen counter like an abandoned relic. I stood there for 20 minutes watching the performance. It was a masterpiece of social engineering. 33 people acting in perfect unison to erase one person. I started to wonder what they had told the children. Had they told them I was a stranger? Had they told them I was a bad person? Or had they simply told them to look away? I saw my youngest cousin Lily looking at me with a confused expression, her mouth open as if she wanted to ask who I was, but her mother, Aunt Linda, quickly pulled her away and distracted her with a candy cane. The level of control my mother had over this group was absolute. She was the matriarch of this deception, and everyone was playing their part for a piece of the pie. As the gift exchange wrapped up, my father stood by the fireplace and raised his glass. He looked around the room with a smug grin and said that this was the best year yet because they were finally unified. He said that the future of the family was secure and that they were moving into a new era of prosperity. He didn't mention my name. He didn't acknowledge that his own daughter was standing 10 feet away, shivering in the draft of the hallway. He was celebrating the theft of my inheritance in front of my face. I felt a calm sort of rage wash over me. It wasn't the kind of rage that makes you scream, it was the kind of rage that makes you think. I walked back into the kitchen and picked up my phone. I called the one person who could help me, my grandfather's old lawyer, Mr. Henderson. He had been retired for years, but I had his personal number because he had been a friend of the family. He answered on the third ring, and his voice was a comfort in the storm. I told him what was happening. I told him about the dinner and the papers I had found and the way I was being treated. He was silent for a long moment, and then he told me something that turned my entire world upside down. He told me that the trust hadn't just been modified by my parents, it had been forged. He explained that my grandfather had come to him weeks before he died to set up a secondary vault, a safety measure in case the family tried exactly what they were doing right now. He told me that there was a digital copy of the original signed and notarized deed stored in a secure cloud server that only he and I had the password for. He said, Elena, they think they are holding the only copy of the truth, but they are holding a lie. I have the keys to the house you are standing in and every acre of that land is yours legally and irrevocably as of 3 months ago. My heart hammered in my chest as the piece of the puzzle finally clicked into place. They weren't just ignoring me to be mean, they were ignoring me because they were terrified that if they spoke to me I would find out the truth before they could sell the land. The sale was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. They were in a race against time and they thought they had already won. I thanked Mr. Henderson and hung up. I walked back to the living room doorway. And this time I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like the owner of the house, and it was time for the guests to leave. I didn't wait for a break in the conversation. I didn't wait for them to look at me. I walked straight to the electrical panel hidden in the pantry, and I flipped the main breaker. The entire house plunged into sudden pitch-black darkness. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by shrieks of surprise and the sound of people fumbling for their phones. In the silence that followed, I used my phone flashlight to illuminate my own face from below, creating a stark, ghostly image in the dark. I spoke then, and my voice was cold and steady and louder than it had ever been. I said, the dinner is over. And so is the lie. My mother screamed for someone to turn the lights back on, but I stood in front of the panel and told them that if anyone touched the switches I would call the police and report a home invasion. I told them that I knew about the forged documents, I knew about the sale on Monday, and I knew that they had spent the last 4 hours pretending I didn't exist in a house that I legally owned. The silence that followed was different than the one before. It was the silence of people who had just realized they were standing on a trapdoor that was about to swing open. The darkness of the living room was punctuated only by the small glowing screens of 33 cell phones that looked like tiny distant stars reflecting off the faces of people who had suddenly become very small. The silence was so thick you could hear the heavy breathing of my Uncle Jim, and the panicked rustle of my mother clutching her stolen folders to her chest. I stood there bathed in the glow of my own flashlight, feeling a sense of power that I had never known. In this house for 20 years I had been the girl who stayed in the background, the one who didn't make waves and the one who allowed herself to be overlooked, but that girl had died somewhere between the kitchen and the stairs. Tonight I told them all that they had 60 minutes to get out of my house, and for the first time in my life nobody ignored me. My father tried to step forward, his face illuminated by his phone screen like a villain in a horror movie. He tried to use his booming voice to tell me I was being hysterical, and that I was making a fool of myself in front of the entire family, but I didn't let him finish. I pulled up the digital deed on my phone that Mr. Henderson had just sent to my email, and I held it up so he could see the official seal of the state of Pennsylvania and my name listed as the sole proprietor of the trust and the property. His voice died in his throat, and for a moment he looked like a man who had seen his own executioner. The room erupted into a different kind of noise. Then it wasn't the laughter of a family dinner, but the frantic bickering of a group of people who realized their golden goose was gone. Aunt Martha started crying, saying she had already put a down payment on a new car based on the money my mother had promised her from the timber sale. My cousins started arguing with their parents about who knew what and when they knew it, and my sister Sarah looked at me with a mixture of fear and envy that made me realize she had been in on the plan from the very beginning. She was the one who had been assigned to monitor my social media to see if I was planning a trip home. She was the one who told them I was too busy with my city life to care about a drafty old house in the woods. I walked over to the fireplace and grabbed a heavy iron poker just to have something in my hand, and I told them that every second they spent talking was a second they weren't packing. My mother finally broke her silence, screaming that I was an ungrateful child, and that she had raised me in this house and that it was hers by right of blood. But I reminded her that blood was exactly what she had ignored all night long. I reminded her of the 33 people who had watched me stand in the cold while they ate, and I told her that if she loved the house so much, she should have loved the person my grandfather actually left it to. The exodus began with a frantic energy as people scrambled to gather their coats and their expensive gifts that they had just opened with such joy. Aunt Linda was trying to shove a whole ham into a cooler while her husband tried to usher their confused kids out the door. They were no longer a unified front, they were individuals trying to save whatever they could before the police arrived. Because I had already dialed the non-emergency line and had the dispatcher on speakerphone so they could hear that I was serious about the trespassing charges, my father tried one last time to negotiate, asking if we could sit down and talk like adults tomorrow morning. But I looked him in the eye and told him that tomorrow morning I would be meeting with the district attorney to discuss the forged documents I had found in the office upstairs. The look of pure terror that crossed his face was the only apology I needed. He knew the paper trail would lead back to his desk, and he knew that I wasn't the quiet little girl he could bully anymore. He turned without another word and walked out into the snow, followed by my mother, who was still sobbing about the unfairness of it all as if she were the victim of this story. I watched from the front porch as the long line of SUVs and trucks began to pull away, their headlights cutting through the falling snow like searchlights. Looking for a way out of a disaster, I stood there in the cold without a coat, but I didn't feel the chill anymore. I felt a strange sense of emptiness, but it was a clean emptiness like a field after a fire. The 33 relatives who had known me my whole life were gone, and I knew that most of them would never speak to me again. And for the first time in my life, I was perfectly okay with that. I went back inside and flipped the breakers back on. The house flooded with light, revealing the mess. They had left behind half-eaten pie plates, scattered napkins, and the heavy antique clock I had brought as a gift still sitting on the kitchen counter. I picked it up and wound it, and the steady ticking filled the quiet kitchen like a heartbeat. I realized then that my grandfather hadn't just left me land and a house, he had left me a test. He knew exactly who his children were. And he knew that they would try to erase me. He wanted me to find my voice, and he wanted me to see them for who they truly were, so I could finally be free of their expectations. I spent the rest of the night walking through the rooms of the big Victorian house, touching the walls and the furniture that now belonged to me. I went into my grandfather's old study and sat in his leather chair, breathing in the faint scent of pipe tobacco and old books that still lingered there. I felt his presence in the silence, and I knew I had done the right thing. The next morning, I didn't wait for the sun to come up before I started the process of securing the property. I called a local contractor to change every single lock on every single door, and I hired a private security firm to patrol the perimeter for the next month. I knew my family would try to come back when the shock wore off, and they would try to use guilt or legal threats to get what they wanted, but they didn't realize that I had already sent copies of the forged documents to Mr. Henderson and a secondary lawyer in the city. I was prepared for a war, because I had already won the most important battle, which was the battle for my own self-worth. I was no longer the girl who could be ignored. I was the woman who owned the ground they were standing on. Over the next few weeks, the texts and calls started coming in. First they were angry and full of threats, then they became pleading and desperate. My mother sent me a long email about how the family was falling apart, and how Aunt Martha might lose her house if the inheritance didn't go through, but I didn't reply. I realized that their definition of family was based on what they could extract from each other, and my grandfather had seen through that long ago. He wanted the land to stay as it was, a sanctuary for the wildlife and a piece of history, but they wanted to pave it over for a quick profit. I decided then that I would never sell it to a developer. I would turn the house into an artist residency, and the land into a protected nature trust, ensuring that nobody could ever use it as a bargaining chip again. I spent my first month of ownership cleaning out the clutter and the memories of people who didn't deserve to stay there, and with every bag of trash I took to the curb, I felt lighter and more like myself. The final confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning when my sister Sarah showed up at the front door looking exhausted and older than her years. She didn't try to yell this time, she just asked if she could come in for a cup of coffee. I let her in, but I didn't offer her a seat. She looked around at the changes I had made, and she sighed, saying that I had always been the lucky one. I laughed, then a real genuine laugh, and asked her if she thought being ignored by 33 people while I sat on the stairs was lucky. She didn't have an answer for that. She told me that the family had decided to stop the legal fight because they knew they couldn't win, and because my father was terrified of the forgery charges being brought to light. She asked if we could ever go back to the way things were, and I looked her in the eye and told her that we were never the way she thought we were. I told her that a family that can ignore one of its own for a piece of land was never a family at all. It was just a group of people waiting for someone to die. When she left, I stood on the porch and watched her car disappear down the driveway just like the others had on that snowy night. I realized that the story of the girl who was ignored wasn't a tragedy, it was an origin story. I had found my strength in the silence, and I had found my legacy in the dark. I walked back into my house and closed the door, and for the first time in my life I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I was Elena, and I was no longer a ghost in my own home. I was the master of it, and the silence that filled the rooms now wasn't the cold silence of exclusion, but the warm, peaceful silence of a life that was finally mine to live on my own terms without the weight of 33 shadows hanging over my head. I had lost a family of blood, but I had gained a future of my own making, and that was a trade I would make every single time.